Winter, 1944. The Third Reich is crumbling, and in a freezing barracks somewhere in occupied France, a group of terrified German women prisoners are about to discover something that will shatter everything they've been told about their enemy. This isn't a story about battles or generals. This is about a bench, a painful wooden bench, and what happened when someone dared to complain about it. What these women experienced in that moment would haunt them for decades, not because it was brutal, but because it wasn't. And that single act of unexpected humanity would force them to question everything they thought they knew about war, about enemies, and about themselves. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is one of the most powerful untold stories of World War II, and it all starts with two words: sitting hurts. Picture this. It's late 1944, and the war Hitler promised would last 1,000 years is collapsing in less than 6. The German front lines are retreating, not in an orderly withdrawal, but in chaos, from France, from Belgium, from the western edges of the Reich itself. And with that retreat comes something the Nazi state never seriously planned for: mass capture. But here's what most people don't know. It wasn't just soldiers being captured. Entire support units were surrendering, supply personnel abandoned, clerks, nurses, radio operators, and thousands of teenage girls. Girls who had been pressed into service through programs like the Reich Arbeitsdienst and Luftwaffenhelferinnen. Anti-aircraft auxiliaries, communications workers, some as young as 16. And suddenly, they were prisoners. For many of these German women, the first shock wasn't the capture itself. Think about that. The first shock was what came after. The silence. No beatings, no screaming, no immediate revenge, just shouted instructions in English they couldn't understand. Confusion, and then movement, long, exhausting movement away from the front lines. These women had been raised on years of propaganda. They'd been told that American soldiers were brutal, vengeful, undisciplined monsters, that capture meant humiliation at best and unspeakable violence at worst. So they marched, terrified, waiting for the nightmare to begin. But it didn't, not the way they expected. They were taken to what the Americans called temporary holding areas. But don't imagine proper camps with buildings and organization. These were improvised enclosures, abandoned farms, schoolyards, factories with shattered windows, open fields surrounded by hastily strung barbed wire. In France and Belgium, U.S. Army military government units were drowning in prisoners, tens of thousands arriving daily. The system was overwhelmed. Food was short. Shelter was worse, and winter had come early. The ground was hard, frozen, wet. The women were separated from male prisoners quickly, usually within hours, not out of chivalry but logistics. U.S. Army regulations required gender segregation where possible, and commanders knew that mixed compounds created discipline problems. So the German women were placed together, sometimes in requisitioned buildings, sometimes in canvas tents that did nothing against the cold, sometimes in long wooden barracks hastily thrown together by engineer units working around the clock. And it's in one of these barracks that our story really begins. The barracks were bare, wooden floors, wooden benches, just rough planks nailed to simple frames, no padding, no backs, nothing. The women had been marching or transported for hours, sometimes days. Many were undernourished. Some were still wearing thin service skirts or ill-fitting coats never meant for winter duty. Their feet were blistered. Their bodies were exhausted. So when they were finally ordered to sit down, the relief lasted maybe 2 minutes. Then the pain began.
These benches weren't just uncomfortable. They were torture devices. Rough, unfinished planks pressing against hips and tailbones already bruised from days of movement. The cold seeping up through the wood. the pressure building, sharp and relentless. Some women shifted constantly, trying to find a position that didn't hurt. Others stood back up entirely, preferring to remain on their feet rather than endure the ache. A few laughed quietly at first, the kind of desperate laughter that comes when exhaustion strips away embarrassment. And then someone said it out loud in German. Sitzen tut weh. Sitting hurts. At first, the American guards didn't understand. These were mostly young men, infantry replacements, rear area troops, military police, many no older than the prisoners themselves. Their German was limited to a handful of commands: Halt, Schnell, Raus. But here's the thing about pain. It's universal. The shifting, the grimacing, the way the women would sit, stand, sit again, then give up and remain standing. The guards could see something was wrong. One guard finally motioned, asking through gestures, "What's the problem?" A German woman, likely a former clerical worker who'd been attached to an anti-aircraft unit, pointed to the bench, then to her lower back and hips. She mimed the pain, her face twisted in discomfort. Another woman repeated the phrase slowly, carefully, hoping he'd understand. Sitting hurts. The guard frowned. He walked over to the bench and pressed his own hand against the wood, testing it. He nodded, not fully understanding the words, but grasping the meaning. Then he walked away without comment. And the women didn't expect anything to happen next. Why would they? They'd been raised in a system where weakness was punished, where discomfort was irrelevant, where orders were absolute and complaints were met with consequences. In the German military, you didn't complain about a hard bench. You endured it, because that's what discipline meant. So when the guard returned an hour later, not alone, but with two others carrying something, the reaction inside the barracks was silence. Complete, shocked silence. Because what they brought was unexpected in every possible way.
They brought blankets. Not confiscated German blankets, but U.S. Army issue. Olive drab, coarse wool, but clean, folded carefully. And they placed them over the benches, one by one, methodically. In some sections, they added straw underneath, scavenged from nearby farms. In others, they adjusted the boards, smoothed down rough edges, or replaced planks entirely. No speeches were given, no explanation offered. The guards simply worked, then stepped back. One of them gestured, "Sit." The women hesitated. Think about what's going through their minds right now. These are women who've been told for years that Americans are savage, that they'd be raped, beaten, murdered, that mercy was a fantasy and kindness a weakness. And now these same monsters are padding their benches? One woman sat down slowly, carefully, testing it. Her shoulders dropped. The pain didn't vanish. The bench was still hard. The cold still crept in from the floor, but the difference was unmistakable. Others followed, sitting, feeling, processing. This wasn't kindness in the way stories usually frame kindness. There were no tears, no dramatic music, no heartfelt speeches. It was practical, quiet, almost bureaucratic. But for these prisoners, it shattered expectations more completely than any grand gesture ever could.
And here's what makes this story even more powerful. This wasn't an isolated incident. Over the following weeks, similar moments accumulated across multiple U.S.-run prisoner compounds in France and southern Germany. Reports describe American guards arranging additional clothing when supplies allowed. Oversized field jackets appeared. Gloves materialized. In one case, recorded by a U.S. Army nurse attached to a processing camp near Reims, women suffering from severe foot pain were allowed to remove their boots during rest periods. In the German military, that would have been unthinkable, undisciplined, weak.
Medical inspections followed U.S. Army procedure, not Nazi ideology. Lice were treated methodically. Frostbite was taken seriously. Even menstrual needs, rarely discussed in official documents but mentioned in memoirs, were awkwardly but practically addressed, often through Red Cross supplies or improvised solutions. There was embarrassment on both sides, sure, but also a sense that these weren't punishments, they were just realities of human existence. The women noticed something else, too. The Americans didn't shout unless necessary. Orders were given clearly. Discipline was enforced, but it was consistent, predictable. When rules were broken, consequences followed, but they were proportional, fair. There were no arbitrary beatings, no collective punishments for individual infractions. For many of these German women, this was their first sustained exposure to authority that didn't rely on fear alone. Now, let me be clear, captivity wasn't easy. Food was basic, canned rations, watery soup, bread when available. Hunger was constant. News from home was non-existent. Many didn't know if their families were even alive. But the small details mattered.
The bench that no longer hurt as much. The blanket that smelled faintly of soap and canvas instead of smoke. The guard who shrugged when thanked, as if the entire situation were unremarkable. These tiny moments of unexpected humanity became anchors in a world turned upside down. By early 1945, as the U.S. Army pushed deeper into Germany, the number of female prisoners increased dramatically. Some camps became more permanent, others remained temporary holding areas before transport to larger facilities. The system was imperfect, often overwhelmed, sometimes chaotic, but the guiding principles remained constant. The Geneva Convention wasn't just an abstract document to the U.S. Army. It was training, doctrine, paperwork, inspections. Officers were held accountable for compliance. Abuse was investigated, not always perfectly, but often enough to create a culture where unnecessary cruelty was discouraged rather than rewarded. For these women, the realization came slowly and unevenly. They weren't being starved on purpose. They weren't being humiliated for sport. They weren't invisible. Years later, some would struggle to reconcile this experience with what they'd been taught. A few spoke of guilt at being treated decently while the regime they'd served committed atrocities elsewhere. Others spoke of confusion. How could the enemy be more humane than their own system? A smaller number spoke of gratitude, though even that word felt dangerous in post-war Germany. But nearly all of them remembered the same types of moments. The day the benches were fixed, the day the blankets arrived, the quiet acknowledgement that suffering wasn't required to prove defeat. In the vast scale of World War II, these details barely register in history books. No battles were won because of a padded bench. No campaigns turned because a guard listened instead of ignored a complaint. But for the women who sat down and felt less pain than they expected, the war shifted in that moment. The enemy became human. Authority became something other than terror. Survival no longer depended solely on endurance, but on adapting to a world that didn't behave the way they'd been warned it would. After the war, many of these women disappeared back into civilian life. Some rebuilt, some struggled, some never spoke of their time as prisoners at all. But in letters, diaries, and interviews collected decades later, the same sentence appears again and again. We thought it would be worse. Sometimes history is shaped not by what happens, but by what doesn't happen. No punishment followed the complaint. No retaliation came. Only a blanket, a repaired bench, and the quiet understanding that even in war, pain didn't have to be the point. That's the story nobody tells you about World War II. Not the battles, not the strategies, but the moment when humanity survived in the most unexpected place, between enemies, in a freezing barracks, over a bench that hurt too much. And maybe, Just maybe, that's the most important story of all.